In this video, we're going to be talking about IAM and roles. What is IAM? IAM is short for Identity and Access Management. Um, think of it like a database that has logins. I mean, what's more than that? Something that just has a list of all the logins of users along with the passwords, and that's pretty much it. And it helps basically control who can actually access your cloud services, and also to kind of limit what you can do on AWS itself. Like, for example, can you restrict certain users from accessing EC2 instances? Can you restrict them from accessing your database? Can you restrict them from deleting everything, etc.? And that's basically what it is. And with IAM users, there's also something called IAM roles, which is basically roles that you can assign it to a computer to do things on your behalf. Um, and I know this is one of those topics where, well, what about computers? And it kind of gets mixed up, but basically, IAM roles and IAM users are similar in the sense that they both will do some API call to make changes in AWS. And I'm just going to make it real simple and short. They're both the same in this argument, for example. However, what we're going to do in the next video, and when I'm going to show you how to create the users and how to create the group policies and everything, we're going to use this exact example where we're going to be talking about Tom, Pam, Jim, and Scott. And we're going to be talking about what their position is and what can they do in their company. So let's talk about that in the next video. So now we're going to talk about IAM and how we have users and how we kind of give them a role, and then what do they have access to. So the best way to look at it is like this. When a user is added to AWS, we give them a name. Then we have two options. Either we give them a group that we assign to them that gives them special permissions or access to certain things, or we just give them access blatantly. Normally, in the real world, what happens is that we'll create a login for them, like for example, Tom, and at that point, we'll assign a group to Tom. And when we assign that group to Tom, that group in itself inherits access to certain things. Now, in this case, we're going to talk about kind of like a made up company where we have products that this company sells. We have three positions in this case. We have warehouse, sales, and a manager. Now, obviously, each of these positions really doesn't have access to other things as others does. So in this case, for example, we're going to talk about Tom. When Tom joined the company, he is part of the warehouse team. And because he's part of the warehouse team, he automatically gets access to the following things: the products, because they have to, touch the products. They have to have access to the warehouse, the vehicles, computers, and access to the orders. Now, this makes sense as far as in a business standpoint where this person named Tom has to have access to all these things. So we designate a group for him, and we say, hey, Tom, you're automatically in the warehouse, and these are your this is the stuff you're gonna have access to, and that's it. Now, if we go over to the salespeople really don't have access to the warehouse itself, but they have access to billing and the order itself. So if we're talking to customers, for example, over the phone, they can place the order, they can go into a billing state where they can kind of get access to all these things to set to place the order for the customer. Like in this case right here, I forgot to put computers, and that's a thing that they obviously need to use to place the order for the customer and access their billing, etc. So let me add computers over to the sales part. Now, this normally does happen with IAM groups. So in this case, we have Pam and Jim, and they're part of the sales group. And because they're part of the sales group, they'll inherit anything that lists in here. So for example, before they only had access to billing and orders, but since I forgot to say, hey, give them access to computers, I automatically go to the group and I add computers to the group. Now they have access to billing, orders, and the computers themselves. And that makes sense from a sales point of view where, yeah, you have to access the computers, you have to be given that access. Then in maker cells, you have to access billing and then the orders template, etc., and fill all that out. So that kind of makes sense. And after that, we have Scott, who is a manager who kind of has to have access almost to everything, right? Where this person needs to manage all these people and they have to have access to all these other things. So let's give him a manager position. And when you give him the manager position, he has access to almost everything. And it makes sense because he needs to have access to the products, the warehouse, even the vehicles themselves, computers, orders, and billing. But he has access to all of these resources because of his position. So when it comes to AWS IAM, the way it works is that you create a user, and depending on a user's needs to work, in a sense that what they need to touch as far as instances, VPCs, computers, database, and everything, you create a special group for them and attach it to them. Like in this case, for example, when Tom joined, he was warehouse, and we said, "Hey, Tom, you're part of the warehouse group." So we add the group warehouse to Tom, and he automatically gets all these access to all these things. Now, in the real world, for example, we'll say, "Hey, you have access to the computers, you have access to the VPC, etc.," and that's fine. And what we could do is later on say, "You know what? Tom got promoted to manager," so what we can literally do is just say, "Hey, you know what? Remove the group," which automatically removes all this. And we're gonna say, "Hey, Tom became a manager." So now let's copy over the settings. Boom. Tom is now a manager. What we ended up doing was we removed his group policy and gave him the manager policy. And because we did that, now he has access to all these other things just like the other managers. So now that we have Tom and Scott, they're both managers. They both have the same access to everything else without affecting anything as far as other groups and other policies that belong to other people. So in the real world, the way it really works is you create a user in IAM, then you create a group policy for that person, and then you give them access to certain things within that policy, and then you attach that group policy to people. And in this case, for example, when an engineer joins the company, we want to give them access to either just a specific machines to work on and only on that machine. And that makes sense because they're new. They want to work on things. They want to work on projects and stuff like that. So you give them a single machine to have access only to, which just makes sense. Or they're part of a special team that needs access to everything because if things break, they have to go in and make changes. So you have to give them an admin role where they have access to everything because we entrusted them in a position where they can touch anything. And that makes sense for someone who's in there repairing things or fixing things, etc., because that's their daily usage. Now, compare that to someone who programs, he probably just needs access to one instance and not multiple things, just like a person like SRE that has access to everything that fixes everything. So this kind of is more of a blanket of understanding how IAM roles are, and just to kind of give a brief overview again, what we talked about, IAM is a login that is usually provided to the person who wants to have access to AWS. When they're given that access, we then either give them a role or we give them permissions directly. And in usual cases, we give them a group policy that, for example, is manager that will give them the access to certain things like products, warehouses, vehicles, computers, and orders and billing, for example. And that's kind of how IAM works in a general sense. So right now what we're going to do is we're going to create two users. One is going to be a salesperson and a manager. And once we do that, we're going to create the group policies for these two positions. The manager is going to have admin access, and then the workers are just going to have just basic access to things. And once we create those groups, we're going to attach those groups over to the users themselves, just to kind of simulate what we saw in the previous slide. So let's go ahead and do that. So all we're going to do is go to services in IAM. Here we go. And then after this, we're going to create users. So we're going to go to users, add user. We're going to call this manager. Now, remember I mentioned earlier, like you give them like a login name and everything. This is they're literally the login name specifically just for this account. We can go more into details on this, but I'm just gonna keep it real simple. Once we do this, all we're gonna do is, give them a password. It's gonna auto generate one, which is fine because this is the password we're gonna give to the user. Um, when you have this set, basically means that when they log in with this password, they have to use a different password, and that's for security purposes, and it's also good common practice. We're gonna go here, and we can add permissions to them directly or create a group to add them to, but for now we're not going to do that right now. We go next, review. Okay. There you go, we create a user. So usually you can see the password right away, or you can send them email login instructions, or you can kind of give them other credentials. We're not going to talk about that for now. So here we go. So now we see we have manager here, and he's part of no groups right now, which is fine because we're going to create them later. So next we're going to create the worker. Perfect. Do worker, password, auto generated. Must create a new password. That's fine. Remember, we're not going to log in. We're just going to create the users. Here we go. We go to tags. That's fine. And then create the user. Okay. Now let's close it. Now we're going to create the group policy. So you're going to go right here at user groups. You're going to go to create group. And what we're going to do is we're going to call this group manager. And we're going to add the manager to the group. We can do this later. I'll show you later how to do worker. So right now we have manager, and right now we're going to give it permissions. Now, as mentioned earlier, we're going to give them admin permissions, which is basically access to everything in AWS. So let's do that real quick. All you have to do is type in administrator. Okay, there we go. Administrator access is the main one. This is the one that gives you admin access to everything. So this is what we're going to do here. And once we do this, we're going to create the group. There we go. Now, if we take a look at the user group and then look at the group name, we're going to see, hey, these are the users in this group. Now, say, for example, if I want to add, say, let me see, me to the admin group, here we go. I'll add the user. Bam. Now, I am part of this group, the manager group. So, the username manager and me, myself, I have added myself to this. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we also have to create a group just for the workers. So they have access, for example, the EC2 instances. So let's do that real quick. Let's go back to user groups. Go to create group. We're going to say cells. We're going to say, an example, EC2. EC2 full access, which is fine. So they have access to only EC2 instances. And then we're going to create the group. Perfect, there we go. Now, what we can do is go to users. Then we can select worker. Once you go to worker, you can go to groups and say, hey, add a user to the groups. And then you can say, hey, go to cells and add to groups. And that's it. So now we have the worker, he's added to the cells group, which has access to EC2 instances. And that's how to manage your users and how to create users groups and how to add the users to the user groups.